Corrupt politician accuses farmer of fraud, then learns he's a key witness. The courtroom was packed, the air thick with tension. Rows of townsfolk sat shoulder to shoulder, their whispers bouncing off the mahogany-paneled walls. At the center of the chaos stood John Harrison, a man with withered hands and a quiet strength born of years tilling his family's farmland. His sharp blue eyes scanned the room, unwavering even under the disdainful glare of District Attorney Walter Prescott. Prescott, a man known for his ruthless pursuit of power, leaned against the prosecution's table, a smirk curling his lips as he tapped a stack of papers against his palm. "Your Honor," Prescott boomed, his voice slicing through the low murmurs, "the evidence against Mr. Harrison is irrefutable. He has defrauded the government and his fellow citizens by falsifying financial aid applications." The accusation hung heavy in the air, igniting a flurry of gasps and whispers from the crowd. John tightened his grip on the edge of the defendant's table, his knuckles white. He'd faced droughts, storms, and dwindling crop prices, but nothing had prepared him for the humiliation of standing accused by a man like Prescott. This wasn't just about his reputation, it was about his family, his land, and a legacy passed down through generations. The judge's gavel struck the bench, silencing the room. "Order in the court. Mr. Prescott, proceed with your opening statements." As Prescott launched into his tirade, painting John as a scheming fraudster, John's attorney, Clara Lawson, leaned in close. "Stay calm," she whispered, her voice steady. "We have the truth on our side." But the truth felt far away to John. Prescott had connections, resources, and the charisma to sway public opinion. He, on the other hand, had only the calloused hands of a farmer and a reputation built on hard work. "Why is Prescott going so hard on this?" Clara muttered under her breath, flipping through the case files. John shook his head. "It's not about me," he said quietly. "It's about something bigger. I just don't know what yet." As Prescott concluded his opening remarks with a flourish, John straightened his back and met the prosecutor's gaze head-on. A flicker of unease crossed Prescott's face, gone almost before it began. And in that moment, John knew Prescott wasn't just after him. This case was about more than fraud. It was about silencing someone who knew too much. The morning sun was barely cresting over the distant hills when John Harrison arrived at the courthouse steps. His boots scuffed against the weathered stone as he climbed, his mind churning over the events of the past month. The quiet farmer, accustomed to days spent mending fences and coaxing life from stubborn soil, found himself thrust into a world he barely understood: accusations, legal filings, and the shadowy dealings of powerful men. It had started innocuously enough. A government inspector had come to his farm weeks earlier, clipboard in hand, asking questions about his crops and the federal subsidy program he had used during the previous drought. John had answered every question honestly, showing receipts, records, and the barren fields where the rains had failed them. The inspector had nodded, taken notes, and left with little fanfare. 2 weeks later, a summons arrived. The charges, fraud, misrepresentation, and theft of public funds, were listed in cold, clinical language that turned John's stomach. At first, he'd laughed at the absurdity of it. Fraud? Him? His wife, Maggie, had tried to reassure him, telling him it was a mix-up that would be cleared up quickly. But when the papers were delivered by a sheriff with a grim look in his eye, the weight of the accusation settled heavily on their small farmhouse. "They've made a mistake," John had said over dinner that night, his fork pushing food aimlessly across his plate. "I don't even know how to defraud anyone." "Mistakes don't come with court dates," Maggie replied quietly, her voice tight with worry. Now, as he sat at the defense table, John's mind replayed those moments. Beside him, Clara Lawson shuffled papers, her no-nonsense demeanor a small comfort amidst the chaos. Clara wasn't the kind of lawyer John would have chosen for himself, but she had come highly recommended by a neighbor who had seen her win tough cases. Across the aisle, District Attorney Walter Prescott prepared to launch his first salvo. Prescott had the look of a man who enjoyed the power of his position: slick back hair, an expensive suit, and a shark-like smile that never reached his eyes. From the moment Prescott had entered the case, it was clear this wasn't about justice. It was about making an example of someone. Prescott's assistant, a young man with a sharp nose and quick fingers, handed him a file. Prescott opened it with the flair of a performer, scanning the courtroom for effect. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice dripping with practiced confidence, "this case is about more than a simple farmer's mistake. It's about accountability and ensuring that every citizen, no matter their standing, is held to the same standard." John clenched his fists beneath the table. He wanted to shout that he had done nothing wrong, that Prescott's carefully crafted words were as hollow as the promises politicians made during election season. But Clara's hand on his arm stilled him. "Don't take the bait," she whispered, barely moving her lips. As Prescott continued, John's thoughts drifted back to the last conversation he'd had with his father before he passed. "This land is everything, son," his father had said, his voice weak but resolute. "Protect it, no matter what." John had made that promise, and it was one he intended to keep. But now, the land, his family's legacy, was at the center of a battle he couldn't fight with tools or calloused hands. What John didn't know was that this trial wasn't just about subsidies. Prescott had other motives, ones that had little to do with justice and everything to do with silencing someone who had uncovered truths too dangerous to reveal. For weeks, whispers had circulated about land grabs, corrupt officials, and deals made behind closed doors. As the trial moved forward, John would learn that his case was a single thread in a much larger web. The judge called for a recess, snapping John out of his thoughts. Clara leaned over, her expression serious. "John, we're not just defending you. We're going to expose whatever Prescott is hiding. But we'll need more than the truth, we'll need proof." John nodded, his resolve hardening. Whatever it took, he would fight. Not just for himself, but for the land, the truth, and the people counting on him to stand tall. And so, the catalyst was set in motion, pushing John Harrison into a battle far larger than he had ever imagined. The courtroom doors closed behind John Harrison with a metallic clang, leaving him standing in the dimly lit hallway. The weight of the morning's hearing pressed heavy on his shoulders. His mind swirled with Clara's words from their brief discussion during recess. "We'll need proof, hard evidence, if we're going to expose Prescott." But where would he even begin? As he walked toward the courthouse exit, the murmurs of spectators and reporters followed him like an unrelenting shadow. Outside, a cluster of townsfolk waited, some offering murmured support, others gawking as if witnessing a spectacle. His wife, Maggie, stood a few steps away, clutching her coat tightly against the brisk wind. Her eyes, equal parts worry and determination, met his, and she approached with their son, Ethan, in tow. "What happened in there?" Maggie asked, her voice trembling but firm. John glanced at their son, then back to Maggie. "Prescott's building his case like he's got something to prove. Or someone to protect. Clara thinks there's more going on here than just the farm." Maggie's brow furrowed as she pulled Ethan close. "What does that mean for us?" John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "It means we've got to fight harder than ever. And it means things are going to get worse before they get better." The following week, things did get worse. John returned home one evening to find a foreclosure notice nailed to his barn door. His farm loans, which had always been manageable, were suddenly called due in full. The bank's representative, a smug man in a crisp suit, had refused to answer Maggie's questions earlier that day, stating only that it was a matter of compliance. "This isn't compliance," Clara said after John handed her the notice at her office the next morning. She examined the papers carefully. "It's retaliation. Prescott's tightening the screws, and he's using every tool at his disposal." "Can he do this?" John asked, anger and disbelief mingling in his voice. Clara looked up, her expression grim. "He shouldn't be able to. But when powerful people work together to protect their interests, the lines of legality blur. We need to hit back with something concrete." As if on cue, a knock sounded at the door. Clara's assistant entered, holding a folder. "These are the reports you asked for," she said, handing them over before leaving. Clara flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowing. "John, take a look at this." She pushed the folder toward him. Inside were records of recent government inspections and subsidy approvals. One name appeared repeatedly: Prescott Agriculture Development Corporation. "He's not just prosecuting you," Clara explained. "He's clearing the way for his investments. Your land isn't the only one targeted. He's been orchestrating foreclosures and buying up farms under dummy corporations." John's hands tightened into fists. "So this is about greed. He wants the land for himself." Clara nodded. "And he's been careful to cover his tracks. But if we can connect Prescott directly to these acquisitions, we might have a chance." That evening, John and Maggie sat at the kitchen table, poring over maps and financial statements Clara had provided. Their modest farmhouse, though dimly lit and modestly furnished, felt like a war room. Maggie traced her finger along the map. "Look here," she said, pointing to a cluster of recently foreclosed properties near theirs. "Every one of these families talked about strange inspections before they lost their farms." John nodded. "We need to talk to them. If they're willing to testify, it could make a difference." But it wasn't that simple. The next morning, John drove to the nearest farm, only to find the owners already gone. The house was boarded up, and the fields were left fallow. The same scene greeted him at the next two farms. When he finally found a family still residing in their home, they refused to talk. The farmer, a wiry man in his 60s, glanced nervously at his wife before shaking his head. "I've got too much to lose, John," he said, closing the door. "I can't help you." Discouraged but not defeated, John returned home to find Ethan waiting on the porch. The boy held up a manila envelope that had been left in the mailbox. "This came for you, Dad," he said. Inside were grainy photos of John meeting with Clara at her office, accompanied by a typed note: "Back off, or you'll lose more than your farm." John's jaw tightened as he crumpled the note in his fist. He met Maggie's worried gaze. "If they think this will scare me off," he said, his voice low, "they don't know me at all." The struggle had deepened, and the stakes had grown higher. But John was more determined than ever to uncover the truth and protect his family's legacy, no matter the cost. The courtroom was uncharacteristically silent as John Harrison stepped to the witness stand. The tension was palpable, a taut string stretched to its breaking point. All eyes were on him, the townsfolk, the reporters scribbling furiously in their notebooks, and most importantly, District Attorney Walter Prescott, who sat at his table with an unshakable smirk. Prescott leaned back in his chair, tapping a pen against his jaw as if daring John to try and disrupt the carefully constructed case against him. John took a steadying breath. He wasn't a man of polished words or dramatic gestures, but he had something Prescott feared: the truth. Clara Lawson, his attorney, rose from her seat and approached the bench. "Mr. Harrison," she began, her voice firm but measured, "would you describe the events leading up to your indictment?" John adjusted the microphone. "It started with an inspection on my farm," he said. His voice, though calm, carried the weight of a man who had endured more than his fair share of trials. "The inspector asked about my subsidies and the drought assistance I received last year. I showed him everything I had: receipts, applications, panned photos of the damage. Thought that was the end of it." "And was it?" Clara asked. John shook his head. "No. 2 weeks later, I got a summons. They said I lied on my application, that I took the money I wasn't entitled to. But I didn't. Every dollar went into keeping my farm alive." Clara nodded and turned to the judge. "Your Honor, at this time, I'd like to enter into evidence a series of documents we recently obtained." She gestured to the clerk, who handed a thick folder to the bench. "These records show a pattern of suspicious foreclosures and acquisitions linked to Prescott Agriculture Development Corporation." The murmurs in the courtroom swelled. Prescott's smirk faltered for the first time. The judge adjusted his glasses, examining the documents. "Ms. Lawson, are you suggesting a conflict of interest involving the prosecution?" "Not just a conflict, Your Honor," Clara said, her voice sharpening. We're suggesting deliberate corruption. These records tie the prosecution's office to fraudulent land acquisitions targeting small farmers, with Mr. Harrison's case being just one of many. Prescott shot to his feet. Objection. This is irrelevant and inflammatory. The judge's gavel struck once. Overruled. I'll allow it. John's heart pounded as Clara turned back to him. Mr. Harrison, are you aware of any attempts to intimidate or silence you during this process? John nodded. Yes. My family received threats. Photos of me meeting with Ms. Lawson were sent to my home, along with a note telling me to back off. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Clara handed another piece of evidence to the clerk. Your Honor, here is a copy of the letter Mr. Harrison received, along with the photographs. These were traced back to an account linked to Prescott's private investigator. Prescott's face reddened, but he held his composure. This is a baseless smear campaign, he spat. An attempt to deflect from Mr. Harrison's crimes. Clara turned sharply. The only crime here, Mr. Prescott, is the abuse of power to ruin hard-working families for personal gain. The judge raised a hand to silence the growing noise in the room. Ms. Lawson, do you have additional evidence to support your claims? Clara gestured toward the courtroom doors. We do, Your Honor. At this time, we call Deputy Inspector David Green to the stand. The doors opened, and a man in uniform entered. Prescott's face turned pale. John recognized Green as the same inspector who had visited his farm months earlier. He walked to the witness stand, his demeanor resolute. Under oath, Green detailed how he had been pressured to falsify reports against specific farms, including John's. I didn't know why at first, Green admitted, his voice shaking slightly. But then I noticed a pattern. Every farm I was ordered to inspect ended up foreclosed and sold to a corporation linked to Prescott. The courtroom erupted. The judge banged his gavel repeatedly, demanding order. When silence returned, Clara addressed Green. Why are you coming forward now? Green glanced at John before answering. Because what's happening is wrong. People like Mr. Harrison don't deserve to lose everything so someone else can get rich. Prescott rose again, but this time his composure was shattered. This is a farce. A desperate attempt to derail a legitimate prosecution. The judge fixed him with a cold stare. Mr. Prescott, sit down. As Prescott sank into his chair, Clara delivered her closing argument, weaving together the threads of evidence and testimony. This case isn't just about John Harrison. It's about standing up to corruption, about ensuring that the powerful can't exploit the system to line their pockets at the expense of honest, hard-working citizens. Your Honor, the evidence speaks for itself. The judge announced a recess to deliberate. As the courtroom emptied, John's gaze met Maggie's from across the room. She smiled faintly, her faith in him unshaken. An hour later, the judge returned. The room fell silent as he began. After reviewing the evidence and testimony presented, this court finds the charges against Mr. Harrison unfounded and dismisses the case. Relief washed over John, but the judge wasn't finished. Furthermore, I am ordering an immediate investigation into the actions of Mr. Prescott and his office. Prescott's face twisted in anger as reporters swarmed him. But John had no interest in his downfall. He turned to Clara and Maggie, pulling them into a tight embrace. For the first time in months, the weight on his shoulders lifted. The battle wasn't over, but the turning point had been reached. The truth had prevailed, and with it, the first steps toward justice. The courtroom's echoes of the judge's ruling still rang in John Harrison's ears as he stepped outside into the crisp afternoon air. The sunlight felt warmer than it had in weeks, a tangible reminder that justice, while slow, could prevail. A small crowd had gathered at the courthouse steps, cheering as John emerged with Maggie and Clara by his side. Reporters thrust microphones forward, peppering him with questions about the trial and his plans for the future, but John raised a hand to silence them. All I want is to get back to my farm, he said simply. That's all I ever wanted. The crowd erupted in applause, but John's focus was already on what lay ahead. While the court had cleared his name, the damage Prescott's schemes had wrought couldn't be undone with a single ruling. Neighboring farms had been lost, livelihoods destroyed, and the trust of an entire community shattered. As he and Maggie walked toward their truck, Clara fell into step beside them. "This isn't over, John," she said. "The investigation into Prescott's dealings will take time, but with Green's testimony and the evidence we presented, they'll uncover everything." John nodded. "I'll help however I can. But first, I've got a farm to rebuild." In the weeks that followed, the fallout from the trial rippled through the community. Prescott's resignation came swiftly, accompanied by public outrage as details of his corruption became front-page news. The state launched a full investigation into the land acquisitions, and several of Prescott's associates faced charges. For the first time in years, the community began to hope for meaningful change. Back on his farm, John threw himself into the work that had always grounded him. With help from neighbors who rallied around him, he repaired the damage caused by months of neglect. Maggie organized a town meeting to address the broader issues that had surfaced during the trial, and Clara agreed to assist in forming a coalition to advocate for farmers' rights. One evening, as John sat on the porch with Maggie and Ethan, he gazed out over the fields. The land had begun to heal, just as he and his family had. Maggie handed him a letter, her smile soft and encouraging. It was an invitation from a state agricultural board, requesting John's participation in a new initiative to protect small farmers from exploitation. "What do you think?" Maggie asked. John turned the letter over in his hands. "I think it's time to do more than just protect my land," he said. "It's time to fight for all of us." The horizon stretched wide before them, glowing with the promise of a new day. Though the battle had been hard-fought, it had forged something stronger, a community united, a family unbroken, and a man determined to ensure no one else would have to endure what he had. As the stars began to dot the sky, John leaned back in his chair, content for the first time in months. The future, once uncertain, now felt firmly within his grasp. Months had passed since the trial, but the story of John Harrison's fight against corruption continued to ripple far beyond his small town. His case had become a symbol of resilience and justice, sparking a statewide movement to protect farmers from exploitation. News outlets followed his journey closely, portraying him not just as a man who had overcome adversity, but as a catalyst for change. On a brisk autumn morning, John stood before a packed auditorium at the state capitol. Farmers, lawmakers, and activists filled the room, their attention fixed on the man who had stood firm in the face of overwhelming odds. Maggie and Ethan sat in the front row, their smiles a source of strength as John approached the podium. "I'm not a politician," he began, his voice steady but raw with emotion. "I'm not a lawyer or an activist. I'm just a farmer, like many of you here today. I've spent my life working the land, raising my family, and believing in the idea that hard work and honesty will see us through." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the crowd. "But what I learned is that sometimes, the system we trust to protect us can fail. It can be manipulated by those who care more about power and profit than people. And when that happens, it's up to us to stand together and demand better." The room erupted in applause, but John wasn't finished. "My fight isn't over," he continued. "None of ours is. This isn't just about my farm or my family. It's about every farmer who's struggled to keep their land, every community hurt by greed, and every person who's been told their voice doesn't matter." He leaned forward, his tone resolute. "We can change this. Together, we can build a system that values fairness and honesty over corruption. We can ensure that no one else has to endure what my family did. But it starts with us, with standing up, speaking out, and refusing to back down." As John stepped back from the podium, the audience rose to their feet, their applause thunderous and unrelenting. In that moment, John knew that his journey, while deeply personal, had become part of something much larger. His voice, once quiet and confined to the fields of his farm, now carried a message of hope and determination that resonated far and wide. And so, As he looked out over the sea of faces, John Harrison understood that the seeds of change he had planted were already beginning to grow.